let us begin our evening because we have some exciting things to move on to. My name is Shelley Woodruff, and I have the privilege of being one of the pastors here at First Baptist Church of Decatur, and I want to start the evening by welcoming you to this hour and to this space. We have a gift of being able to partner with Georgia Center for the Book and our local independent booksellers often to bring these conversations to the Decatur community, conversations that matter, conversations that bring us closer together and bring us out of our comfort zones and entertain us, but enlighten us in so many different ways. So it's a gift that we get to bring these events week after week. And we're so excited for this particular one. Not only are we partnering again with Georgia Center for the Book and A Cappella Books, but we're also partnering tonight with WABE as well as the Carter Center. So this is pretty exciting. In just a minute, we're gonna have Lois and Mo come out, and I know that's what you're all waiting for. Before they come out though, I do want to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. We'd really appreciate it. It helps with our sound and our recording, and then it's just also so much less rude. We appreciate it. And I do also want to remind you, if you do need to use a restroom while you are here and you need to use one of these that are on this hallway that are accessible, you'll be on camera. If you go to the ones in the back and down the stairs, you can escape the camera and being remembered for having to exit early. Thank you for being here. It really is a privilege to have you in this space for this purpose. But without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Lois and Mo.
From WABE in Atlanta, this is City Lights. We are in a beautiful church here at First Baptist Church of Decatur, and while it's not a Catholic church, we're going to begin with a confession. Specifically, Mo Rocca's confession from his new book, Roctogenarians. He writes, "I prefer profiling older actors and luminaries over buzzy young talents. Part of it is that I'm an old soul myself, perhaps because my parents were older when they had me. Older people just have more to say, more stories. They're more likely to say what they think and less afraid of what others think of them." Roctogenarians, late in life debuts, triumphs, and comebacks by Mo Rocca and Jonathan Greenberg is the perfect antidote to a culture obsessed with youth. WABE listeners love hearing him on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. CBS Sunday viewers connect with him in the most personal way. And readers of Mo's previous books have another reason to rejoice. He's here to share some of the delightful, uplifting, but not facelifting stories from this collection. Please welcome Mo Rocca.
My goodness. Lois, thank you so much for that introduction, and I am privileged to be interviewed by you here at First Baptist, so thank you so much for hosting me here.
Oh, what an honor for all of us. Now, how did an encounter with Chance the Rapper lead to writing this book?
Well, in 2015, I was making an appearance on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, where I've been a panelist for over 20 years now. I was 46 at the time. We did this episode outside in Chicago's Millennium Park, and there were thousands of people there. And while we love our fan base for Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, they're usually not the types of fans that scream. You know, maybe for Ina Garten they will, but for Chance, this was different. Chance the Rapper was young, was red hot, and the audience was going bananas. They were literally trying to climb up onto the stage, some of them. And I thought I would we were talking about his style of writing, and I thought I'd get an easy laugh by asking sort of a dorky question. And it was a dorky question. I said, I'm 46, am I too old to become a rapper? And it got a laugh. Not a big one because it's not that funny, but he looked at me straight ahead without skipping a beat, and he said, I don't know, it might be too soon for you to become a rapper. And that got a laugh too. The conversation moved on, but I really was thunderstruck because I know that beneath that joke and that response, he was saying something truthful, which is, you might not have something to say yet in your life. It may take you a while longer. And first of all, I think he's right. And I realized, and I was a little bit ashamed, that I had fallen into the trap of thinking that at 46, I was somehow over the hill. I never would have admitted that, but I think it came out. I think I asked that jokey question because something inside me said, oh, all these opportunities have passed me by, and you know, I'm now at a point where exit ramps are starting to close, and you know, and I'll have to bargain, you know, in terms of what choices I make. I think that's how pervasive and frankly insidious the message we're given is about aging. And look, you know, my beatboxing is not very good. I'm not going to become a rap star. I'm not delusional, but I do think I and other people entering their 60s, 70s, and 80s are still growing in different ways. Will I become sort of a ballet dancer with New York City Ballet? Probably not. Physical things obviously are inevitably become more limiting, but the book includes stories like Diana Nyad, who swam from Cuba to Florida when she was 64. So even there are stories and examples of people actually growing as they get older.
Oh, it is so refreshing. And as you point out, good health helps, but it's not the only thing. Later we can talk about Henri Matisse.
Absolutely, and how endings are beginnings in a way.
Oh, gosh. Well, early on, you write that you want readers to think of this book as a banquet. So will you let Colonel Sanders provide the catering?
Well, I mean, my goodness, how there'd be a riot if I said no fried chicken, right? Who doesn't love, you know, I mean, my mouth starts watering just even thinking of that story. My co-author, Jonathan Greenberg, and I wanted to start with that story because it's, everyone knows Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's a global brand. But the story of Harlan Sanders is worth repeating, which is, you know, this was a man who grew up, first of all, very, very poor, who had a 7th grade education. He, by his late 30s, had settled into sort of a comfortable existence in the small town of Corbin, Kentucky. He had a Shell gas station slash chicken and biscuits joint. It was doing fine. Then a highway in the early 1950s came through Kentucky, bypassed his eatery, which was Sanders Corton Cafe, and the bottom fell out. The business collapsed. He had to sell it at a loss at auction. And by this point, he was 66. He was now living off of Social Security, which was $105 a month at that point. He got in his car with 2 pressure cookers and a bucket of his secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices, and past the point of traditional retirement, he drove town to town cooking for strangers and, hoping to get them hooked on the recipe. And within 8 years, when he was 74, he was the face of a Kentucky Fried empire of 800 outlets worldwide. He did what he had to do, though he could have subsisted. He didn't, and he didn't look backward, which I think is a quality that a lot of the people in this book have. He just kept moving forward.
And he was 20 years older than you were.
Exactly, yes. So I don't know what Mo Roccas would serve. I don't know what that fast food chain would serve, but I'm going to start thinking.
Fusion. Wine is a vivid example of things that get better with age. I was fascinated by the story of Mark Gergich.
Yeah.
Will you talk about his achievement?
Yeah, I wanted to find people who, in different worlds, and I have a friend who has worked in winemaking for many years in Napa, and I asked Scott, who is someone from the wine world, which I know very little about, who is an exemplar of a Roctogenarian, somebody who just continued growing and did not accept the idea that the last third of your life is a time for winding down. And he said, Mark Gergich is basically we're in a church, so I'll say a lowercase g God in the wine world. And we didn't know the story of Mark Gergich, and it is a remarkable story. This is somebody, one of 11 children, who also grew up in dire poverty in what was then Yugoslavia. And from the age of 2, he was consuming wine, but only because water was unsafe to drink. And so wine, for its antiseptic properties, would be mixed with water for safety reasons. And he eventually ended up going to university and studying viticulture and enology at the University of Zagreb. And a professor had managed to go to California and then come back behind the Iron Curtain and teach. And he had to be very, very careful, this professor, because saying anything good about the capitalist West could have gotten him in trouble. And the students begged and begged for this teacher to tell them what Napa was really like, what California was really like. And he finally whispered 2 words. He said, California, paradise. And so it became Mark Gergich's dream to make it there. So he managed to get to West Germany, overstay intentionally his visa, go to Canada, and then through a family friend, a relative who was a Catholic priest, gain entry into the United States. And where he really made his mark was at a legendary competition called the Judgment of Paris in 1976, which to commemorate the bicentennial, a British wine promoter, a real showman, created a competition, held a competition in Paris between French wines and American wines, specifically Californian wines. And people thought it was kind of a joke. In fact, the entire panel of judges was French. I mean, there was not a single non-French member, but it was a blind taste test. And his white wine from his vineyard won by a long shot.
Quelle horror.
It was remarkable, and overnight it really changed the reputation of Californian wines. So this Croatian immigrant living the American dream really put American wines on the map. And he eventually, which is a really wonderful last third of his life, he only died last year at age 100, he returned to Croatia and set up his own winery there and helped improve the reputation of Croatian wines. He also helped support an investigation into the origin of Zinfandel, which people had thought variously had originated from an Italian grape or a Hungarian grape. It turned out indeed to be a Croatian grape, so he was very, very proud of that.
It's a beautiful story, yeah. And I just think How perfect that in 1976, in the bicentennial, an immigrant delivers that stunning story.
It's wonderful. And he said, look for miracles in your own life. They are there. And, when he returned to Croatia, he was in his 60s and 70s when his daughter and nephew helped establish a Grgic winery in Croatia. So he just kept evolving, he kept changing, and he was actively running that vineyard until he was about 95.
Okay.
I know, pressure's on. No excuses.
Wine is quite the preservative.
Right, very well put.
Thank you.
He was drunk with power.
Among the more moving stories you include is that of the Golden Girls star, Estelle Getty.
Well, I think by law, if you write a book like this, you have to include at least one Golden Girl.
But she wasn't even the oldest, which was ironic. Harvey Fierstein said that during the AIDS crisis, she was every gay person's mother. She was just an astonishing humanitarian. I mean, such deep humanity. Would you talk about how her love for acting sustained her before she became famous?
Well, I think, all four of those women were remarkable. And I think it's interesting that they all, by the way, came up through the theater, which made them so good at working with a live audience. I've always thought that there's more of a relationship between a situation comedy and the stage than there is between film and TV in that case, because those women all knew really how to work an audience. I mean, Betty White had come up through television and radio, but the other three were real stage veterans, including Estelle Getty. And Estelle Getty had wanted from a very early age, she was born on the Lower East Side of New York, and her parents, from the age of 4, would take her as a special treat to the Academy of Music, where she'd see early movies and vaudeville shows as well. She married at 23. She had 2 sons. She raised her family. All the while, she held on to this dream of acting. She saw as much theater as she could. She took every single part that she could. As she got older, she would later say that she was only getting cast as mothers, Jewish mothers, Italian mothers, Irish mothers, every kind of mother. She said that everyone's mother except the mother of Attila the Hun she played. But she did something that I wish the word stick-to-itiveness were actually in the dictionary, because it's one of my favorite words. But she went to an off-Broadway play written by a then unknown Harvey Fierstein, and she really liked it, and she was so persistent. This was after her kids had grown up, and she was able to turn her focus back full-time to this dream. 45 years into the dream, right? I mean, she had really held on to this thing. She wasn't going to let it go. And she went backstage and she introduced herself and she said, "Write me a part." And he was, I think, so taken aback and obviously charmed that he did it. And so the play she had been watching would end up just being one part of what would become Torch Song Trilogy. And in the last third, she very memorably played the mother. And came to really represent, sort of, in a way, the mother of every gay man, I think, during a very difficult period. And so that play eventually went to Broadway. And then at the age of 62, she made her national television debut. And so this was really, at this point, more than 50 years after she'd begun dreaming of a career in acting. And in the very first episode of The Golden Girls, she was seen by more people than had seen her collectively in theater all of her life. And I found it very, very moving. It's also, and this is, people, of course, make different choices, but, it almost seemed like a great reward. It almost seemed, because, she had raised her kids, she had, built this family, and And I think you could say, she might not have put it this way, but she had sacrificed a lot. And so it really must have been very sweet. Certainly for her fans, I think it was very sweet.
You point out they had to make her look a lot older.
Oh, yeah.
62 is not so old.
Yeah, no, we have a picture in there where you see that she did not look as old as the character Sophia. And in fact, she was a little bit younger than B. Arthur, who played her daughter on the show.
Oh, figure.
But she put on, to audition, and again, she wasn't really known. She put on a powdered wig and made herself look older.
I love the way you coupled the stories of Rita Moreno and Morgan Freeman.
Yeah.
And you point out that his rise to becoming a superstar is almost entirely the result of his achievements playing elderly characters.
Yeah, it's interesting how with actors a lot sort of have to age into the roles that they're best suited for. But I did want to pair Morgan Freeman with Rita Moreno because, and I knew this from about 11 years ago when I first profiled Rita Moreno for CBS Sunday Morning. Rita Moreno became a star very early in life, and then after she married and had a daughter, she and her husband moved east to New York. And as sort of I wouldn't call it a retirement, but kind of a sort of a lower impact job, let's just say, she joined the cast of The Electric Company, which happened to be my first television memory. I found, with all due respect to Sesame Street, it really was the slow lane. I mean, Electric Company was very hip and very cool. And I remember as a kid,
PBS.
I was totally excited when she'd go, "Hey, you guys!" At the beginning, for some reason, it really excited me. I also liked the fact that there was a commercial. I'm suddenly forgetting, was it a shampoo commercial in the 70s where they'd go, "Rita Moreno, you've won an Oscar, a Tony, a Grammy, and an Emmy, and you look great. And then how do you do it?" And then she said it was because of the shampoo or something. But when everybody started using this term EGOT, for Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony, I thought, it's not an EGOT, it's a full Moreno. That's what it should be called. Because I remembered that ad, and she, even though Helen Hayes actually beat her by about a month. And you're probably all wondering, what did Helen Hayes win a Grammy for? It was for her rap album. No, I'm kidding. All right, so we all remember that. No.
Chance encouraged her.
No, and so Rita had told me back then, Rita, because now I've interviewed her a few times, so I get to call her by her first name. Rita had told me that when she did Electric Company, this was sort of her coming down from a peak, though she would then have many chapters after that. Coming down from a peak also because the expectation was at the time that if you were in your 40s and a woman at that time, it was basically over in showbiz. So she was sort of what she thought was easing out of a career. Morgan Freeman was one of her co-stars on Electric Company, and he had not yet shown his full potential. And in fact, he was very frustrated by being on this kids show. And at one point, he was starting to come in late because he was very unhappy with it, and she sort of gave him a talking. So they had I wouldn't say it was a complicated relationship, but it was a full relationship. And so, from her telling and from his, he appreciated that. What she didn't realize was why he was frustrated, because he was so talented and had not been able to show that. We wanted to tell his full story because he had not broken out yet, in part because of his integrity. So for instance, he went to a television commercial audition once, and there was a part that was literally called The Jew, and he objected to it and walked out of the audition. There was another project he was on where there was a stereotypical and demeaning portrayal of a Native American. He objected to it. So he had uncompromising principles. After Electric Company, he then went on to great stage work and then became a household name when he was 52 years old in Driving Miss Daisy. And it's a little bit ironic because people thought he might be too young for that role. And then he then won, I guess, his Oscar I want to make sure I have this right, when he was 60, and it's really when he turned 60 that his career really started doing gangbusters, partly because of that gorgeous voice also, because who doesn't want to hear that voice, a real actorly voice. So their lives are sort of intertwined in a way. She, of course, ended up having these next chapters beginning in her 60s, and then in her late 80s and 90s, it's defied sort of any kind of expectation. And I can tell you, when you interact with her, you forget that she's not in her 40s. I mean, it's really remarkable. But they've each, in a really kind of poetic way, have each presented each other with SAG Lifetime Achievement Awards in their late years. So.
And was it Helen Mirren who gave the
Right.
award to Morgan Freeman? She quoted Lord Byron.
She quoted Lord Byron about it's a beautiful verse about how aging means that, the twilight of your faculties, something or other, and then she capped it off with bullshit. Now that I should not have said in here. I'm so sorry. I mean, I'm so sorry.
Okay. Mo, why is the story of Frank McCourt one of your favorites?
I find the story of Frank McCourt, the author, so moving. Frank McCourt, for much of his life, was a high school English teacher. And his students, to sort of engage his students, he would tell them stories of his upbringing in Limerick, Ireland. They were captivated. They and many other people told him that he should write his life story. And I think that a lot of people can relate to this. Whether or not they have the talent of Frank McCourt, I think that's irrelevant. Frank McCourt doubted that his story was worth telling. And I find that very, very sad. People who go through life, especially in the later parts of their lives, thinking and doubting that their stories are worth telling. He eventually decided, in his words, that he would die howling if he didn't tell his story. He finally did tell his story, and part of the reason he didn't want to tell his story is he was ashamed of the poverty he grew up in Limerick, Ireland. He finally did tell his story. It was published when he was 66. Angela's Ashes was a literary sensation. And he said about that, about the publication of it, he said, "It took 2 years and all of my life to write this story." And the book itself is, of course, very, very moving, but his story and the writing of it is equally moving. And a lot of these people, I mean, this is in a quite literal and literary way, sort of returning to childhood, reflecting on childhood. But I think a lot of these stories, you mentioned Matisse, and I know we're going to get to that, but I think as people get older, there's a kind of decluttering that happens, and in many cases a kind of a return to a childlike, not childish, but a childlike state of kind of simplicity. And I think that was the case again in a more obvious way with Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose chapter is alongside Frank McCourt. Her daughter, a controversial figure who deserves her own TV series, but her daughter was very wise on this point, Rose Wilder, and told her, you lived at an extraordinarily important point in American history, the closing of the frontier. You saw it all. The frontiersmen, the pioneers, the farm towns into the cities, this evolution of American life. Her life post Little House, what we know from the TV series, which I love and is different from the books, but her life post Little House was very difficult. She was very, very poor. And her daughter finally told her, write down your life story, but write it as if you're just writing for yourself, like you're writing a diary. And I can't think of better advice for a writer. And so Laura Ingalls Wilder, in 8 books, the first of which was published when she was 65, told the story of her life on the prairie. And I read those books as a kid in such a compelling, beautiful, simple in the best kind of way, style.
Henri Matisse, my favorite visual artist. I had no idea the depth of his illness when he made these magnificent cutouts. Would you tell the story?
So Matisse, by the middle of his life, was already very, very famous, acknowledged as an extraordinarily important modernist painter. In his 70s, he was stricken with cancer, with stomach cancer, and it robbed him of the ability to paint. He could no longer sit upright. He had to be either sort of reclined in a wheelchair or in a bed. And rather than just kind of lying back and reflecting sort of on a highlights reel of his greatest hits, and I'm not even sure it was a conscious decision. It just seemed, probably was instinctual. He traded in the paintbrush for a giant pair of scissors and just began cutting shapes out of, I wouldn't call it colored construction paper, but paper that had in fact been painted, and and thus commenced this, epoch, this brilliant chapter of his career of the paper cutouts. One of the things I found so compelling about this is that he himself described this as almost a return to childhood, a fascination with bright colors and shapes, and a kind of lack of complicatedness. He called it a second life. But he just began doing this, and this was a whole new chapter for him. I live in New York. I'm lucky enough to be able to go to MoMA, to the Museum of Modern Art, and see the swimming pool, which is, mounted in a room there at the museum. But I just think it's such a beautiful tale of renewal, and also how an ending is a beginning, if you want it to be. And a great example of resourcefulness.
And while the stomach cancer made him infirm, didn't take away his creativity, his need to create, and
his joy also, he described it as a kind of liberation, of it being set free, that lack of complication. I hope that for myself, that the noise in your head starts to quiet, I think, as you get older. I find that there's less hectic babbling going on up here. I hope that's a good thing.
So good for you.
Yeah.
Well, the joyousness continued beyond the cutouts with that gorgeous chapel just outside of Nice in France. Would you talk about that?
Well, one of the people who had taken care of him, she became a nun. Then she took her vows and then asked him to help with the design of a chapel. He was not a religious person, but the chapel and I have not been lucky enough to see this myself. I've seen pictures of it, but the cutout work essentially formed the basis sort of for the stained glass in this chapel, and he ultimately saw that as kind of the pinnacle of artistic creation for him. And there's something quite beautiful that it was a house of worship.
And if you have had the privilege to visit, or if you ever get to visit, it is walking into joy and light.
You've been there.
Yes.
Wow. When did you go? Why didn't you tell
My
me?
husband planned this incredible trip when I turned 30 in 1983.
That's really terrific. Wow. So you were like at the 1/3, or we'll call it the 1/4 point then. We're very optimistic here.
I love it. One of my favorite Roctogenarians is Peter Mark Roget. His brilliance showed up early in life, but that thesaurus did not appear until he was 73. How did his obsession with synonyms lead to this indispensable tool for using words?
Oh, indispensable. I mean, absolutely. I mean, my goodness. Google, what is a synonym for, agile? No, Roget, as a young man, and I could relate to this, liked compiling lists. I did the same. I just loved, I know the capital of every country in the world. And by the way, if you came in here thinking, I wish I knew the capital of that country, and you didn't have a chance to look at your phone, feel free to yell it out right now.
Kuala Lumpur?
Well, you did it in the opposite. That's the capital of Malaysia.
That is the capital. Dang.
Anybody else? What? There's no such country as Rhodesia anymore. It's Zimbabwe, and the capital's Harare. Okay.
And that's why he has such high scores on wait, don't tell me.
Somebody yell out Djibouti. The capital of Djibouti is Djibouti. Nice try. So Roget began compiling these lists. In his case, it was because there was a lot of personal tragedy in his life, and it's believed that this was a coping mechanism. And I can understand that a coping mechanism is just focusing sort of on these lists and kind of becoming a student of assignments you create for yourself. And he then went on to become a doctor. He was sort of like the Doogie Howser of his time. He was really a doctor very early on. But he then returned to these lists in his 70s, and his thesaurus was published when he was 73. He kept refining it, though, and he lived until he was 90, and he was still working on it because I guess, I don't know, finding the right word is sometimes kind of hard.
Take many years. Now, Mo's wit is evident throughout this book. But one bit that made me laugh out loud was the description next to this photo of Peter Mark Roget. If you have the book, page 94.
Please turn to page 94.
Please do.
In your freshly purchased copy of the book.
Yes, because the description opposite Roget's photo reads, Peter Mark Roget, circa 1865, looking dignified, and in parentheses, also courtly, stately, majestic, august. Yes. Bravo, Mo.
And there probably should be a credit to Google there on that one.
Our late congressman and hero, John Lewis, talked about good trouble.
Yeah.
The civil rights, yes. And he wanted to be a preacher. When he was 6 years old, he used to preach to his chickens. Was not happy when some of them ended up as dinner. But the civil rights movement senior leaders made tremendous contributions, and very few of them are well known. Please tell us about the perseverance of Mary Church Terrell.
So I can only speak for myself. When I think of the civil rights era, I think of the younger leaders. You know, John Lewis was 25 when he led the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 34 when he delivered the I Have a Dream speech. Obviously, the young leaders were heroic. What my co-author and I wanted to do, though, in keeping with the theme of the book, is really focus on a senior leader. And I did not, before this, I must admit, I had not heard of Mary Church Terrell. It is a remarkable story. Mary Church Terrell was one of the co-founders of the NAACP. She was born while the Civil War was still raging. She got an advanced degree, one of the first black women to do so, and she was an early activist in the fight against the brutal practice of lynching. She, in fact, went to the White House as a young woman with a much older Frederick Douglass to petition President Benjamin Harrison to make stronger statements against lynching. So she had lived her life on many fronts of the civil rights struggle. By the time she was in her 80s, it's fair to say she had more than earned her rest. At around that time, she was rejected admission to the I want to get this right, the American Association of University Women, solely on the basis of her race, because of course I had mentioned she had an advanced degree. And around the same time, she was asked to join the campaign to fight segregation at lunch counters in Washington, D.C. This was in the 1950s. And of course, this was an extraordinary shame that in the capital of the United States, public accommodations were still segregated. There were laws on the books from that hopeful, ultimately tragic period of Reconstruction that in fact, mandated desegregation and public accommodations, but those laws had been ignored. So at the age of 86, she rejoined the fight, and she led sit-ins at a restaurant called Thompson's Restaurant in Washington, D.C., and had to make, over the course of 3 years, 4 different visits as the suit was tossed out, reinstated, went through the appeals process, and eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and the right side was victorious. So she lived to see that victory, died shortly afterwards at 90. What I find particularly powerful about this, aside from the obvious, is that a person of that age doing this, at best, is going to be able to enjoy the fruits of her labor for a very short time. I mean, right, she was already 86. She was doing this for her literal and metaphorical children and children's children. But I think that there's something so powerful about people of that age putting themselves on the line in this way. I mean, what a patriot. I mean, what an extraordinary act.
Oh, just magnificent. Good trouble. We take pride in him as a local hero of international renown, of course. Jimmy Carter is 99.
Yeah.
What did you want to emphasize about him in Roctogenarians?
Well, I wanted to emphasize what he said when he left office, basically, in keeping what he said, which was he was leaving the presidency to return to a more important role, which was becoming a citizen. And of course, he's more than fulfilled that goal and that promise. I mean, you know, rankings of presidents change, and they will continue to change. His ranking will change, and you know that wasn't our concern here. But it seems undebatable that at least in the modern age, there has never been a post-presidency like this. I mean, you know, this post-presidency has we were talking about synonyms before. What's an antonym for cashing in? I mean, what he's done as a citizen. And when he was a young man and went to visit Admiral Hyman Rickover, Rickover asked him, "Did you do your best when you were at the Naval Academy?" And he answered honestly, and he said, "I didn't always do my best." And Rickover was very angry and walked out of the room. He still ended up accepting Carter into the program, but I think by this point, if Admiral Rickover were alive, he would attest to the fact that President Jimmy Carter has done his superhuman best.
Mo, when I read that in the book, I interpreted it as part of Carter's humility.
Yeah.
That he
And
couldn't
honesty.
say, yes, he'd done his absolute best, because what is perfection? You're always supposed to be striving.
Absolutely. Yeah, I seriously doubt he was winging it at the Naval Academy.
No, that would have been the Air Force.
I tried sometimes, but there's this really great game I put on my phone, and I need to take at least a couple of hours each day to work.
Well, if you have not seen the film, the documentary Carterland, have any of you seen it? Yes, it was part of the Atlanta Film Festival last year. It is a marvelous reassessment of his presidency and a wonderful overview of his life. There's another terrific Carter documentary called Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President.
Yes, and that is
Very
excellent.
Good. I encourage you to check those out.
But one thing, and maybe I'm being a little Pollyannish here, but I mean, as we know, we are in such a polarized environment, and my goodness, the internet is an ugly place. But I have noticed a couple of right-wing commentators, when the subject of Jimmy Carter comes up, saying this is a very decent man. And these are people who, if they're saying that, that's kind of a remarkable thing. So if Jimmy Carter can bridge the gap,
Truly,
or I should say, if anyone can, it's President Jimmy Carter. Yeah.
Truly a badge of honor. Reading your entry about Madame Clicquot makes me want to pop open a bottle of Veuve Clicquot. What's her sparkling story?
Well, Madame Clicquot became a widow very early, at the age of 37. And this is in 19th century France. And the laws were such that she had more rights as a widow than she did as a married woman. So she had no incentive to remarry. And she built this Champagne empire. And we thought it would be important to tell the stories of widows. And a couple of the stories, not all of them, a couple of them concern women, Madame Clicquot and Mary Delaney, who, both of whom had great incentive not to remarry. And it did make me reflect on an uncomfortable truth that I've observed, which is, I don't know, I've met older women who love their husbands and will be very sad when their husbands, kick it. And, but also, I think a part of them are sort of like, all right, let's get on with the show. Not because they're going to be very sad. They will mourn their husbands. Husbands, your wives will mourn you. But, they've got a lot of living to do, right? As the song from Bye Bye Birdie says. Yes. Okay, and I will tell you, I'm not saying my grandmother was that person. My grandmother, who I loved, who worked full-time at a Washington, D.C. department store until she was 87. But the best years of my grandmother's life were from 77 to 87. I really mean that. I developed a whole cooking show inspired by her called My Grandmother's Ravioli. But my grandmother loved my grandfather, but when she was widowed, she could have the girls from the store. She'd say the girls from the store are coming over. They'd, drink a little wine, they'd have some fun. And she just, she was kind of she was kind of reborn. Is that, I mean, listen, I'm here to be real.
Well, also in the chapter on widows is another amazing story of determination.
And this is very different. Very
different. How did Myrlie Evans finally achieve justice for her husband's murder?
Well, Myrlie Evers Williams, her husband, the great civil rights leader Medgar Evers, was murdered in Mississippi when he was 37. She was only 30. And the killer was exonerated in the first trial. And then it turned out that years later, I think 26 years later, it emerged that there had been witness tampering. And this was a very big uphill battle to bring Byron Della Beckwith back to trial and to try to bring him to justice. And polls showed that Mississippians did not want to reopen this. And records at the courthouse mysteriously had disappeared, but she had kept copies of everything, and which thankfully, and so it was indeed he was retried, and 31 years after her husband's murder, he was convicted, and polls afterwards showed that Mississippians were in fact very happy about this, the majority of them. And Myrlie Evers Williams said, listen, Mississippi has problems, but it's changed, and she was optimistic about future changes. But she never gave up on this. She never gave up on this. So it's a very different kind of widow story.
Oh, fantastic. Roctogenarians include subjects both real life and fantasy. Yoda is my favorite in that category. You've got to read it. And examples across species, if you will. There's a marvelous story about a farm community that's for retired racehorses, and the tale of a tortoise that is not a fable. Mo, who is Mr. Pickles?
So, it was important, I think, to include tales of personal milestones, so late in life love, like Carol Channing finding love at 82 finally. And I just do want to take, because Carol Channing's always worth a little tangent. Carol Channing's previous marriage had been 40 years long, and she was very unhappy. She and her husband had only had relations twice in those 40 years. And apparently the matinee and evening performances had both been panned by the critics. And after her husband died, happy widow there, she then hooked up with her junior high school sweetheart, Harry Colligian, and they had 2 blissful years at the end. But then there's late in life parenthood, which is where Mr. Pickles, the Houston Zoo tortoise, comes in. He was 90 when he became a first-time father. We're very, very happy. And, we were impressed by Al Pacino, who had a kid. But Al Pacino was only 83. I mean, Mr. Pickles was 90. I believe Mrs. Pickles, and I don't know that they were actually legally married, but Mrs. Pickles, I think, was 51 or something. But the radiated tortoises live until about 150, so we could end up seeing more from Mr. Pickles.
Isn't that
the kids are so cute. They're named Dill, Gherkin, and Jalapeno.
How adorable
and
is that?
I mean, go to the internet. Those kids are so cute. They're brown and gold shells. They're just adorable.
I love that. So
and by the way, the Mr. Pickles and Carol Channing stories are totally unrelated. I want to be clear about that.
The fact that wine improves with age is well known, but architects in old age getting greater, who knew?
Well, I'm glad you were surprised. I must confess, this is something that I knew before, and it indeed has been written about, that so many architects peak late in life. I think there are a couple of reasons practical reasons, I think, one of which is if you're spending a lot of money in commissioning a project, you want to go to somebody for good reason with experience. And also a lot of the more established you are as an architect, the more likely you're going to have a support staff and have to be, and not be responsible for, I guess, some of the grunt work. But, the story of Frank Lloyd Wright and the Guggenheim is a pretty inspiring story. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, had been celebrated for much of his life. Falling Water in Western Pennsylvania was on the cover of Time magazine when that was really a very big deal. But in his late 70s, he received a commission from Solomon Guggenheim to do a museum in New York City. And he was 84 when he submitted the design. And it was very controversial because he had taken a design that had been discarded for a Maryland car park, basically, that was going to be in the mountains of Maryland. And the ramp, for people who know the Guggenheim, was where the cars would go. And he put that aside, so he pulled it out for this museum. And the greatest artists, abstract expressionists and modern artists of the time signed a letter protesting the design because they said this was about the architecture and it was not functional for the art. And Frank Lloyd Wright persisted, and the museum was finished very shortly after he died. 1.3 million visitors a year, I think, would disagree with those artists. I mean, it is a marvel. And, I think it's sort of, critics have said that its relationship to Central Park is not unlike the relationship of Falling Water to those forests and the rocks and streams of Western Pennsylvania. It just sort of belongs there. And I love the story of I.M. Pei, because I.M. Pei similarly had a design for a pyramid that would be atop the JFK Library in Boston. It didn't work out. The JFK Library did not include that pyramid. And when Francois Mitterrand, the president of France, asked him to take the 800-year-old Louvre, which you have to have a long memory to know this, to remember this, but it was kind of dumpy as a museum. It was uncomfortable. It was hard to navigate. It needed a refresher, to say the least. And he brought in I.M. Pei, and the French were horrified when they saw the drawings that he wanted to put a pyramid in the middle. And Mitterrand, to his credit, stood behind Pei, and at 75, that aspect of the museum rejuvenation was finished, and it's become an icon of Paris. I mean, some would say rivaling the Eiffel Tower, but what I love about it is that it's such a rock and roll move to take an 800-year-old Paris and an 800-year-old palace and put a glass pyramid in the middle. I mean, he could have done something that really more obviously, quietly conformed with the palace, but he didn't do that. And I think it's so appropriate that after that, his next commission was, in fact, the Rock and Roll Museum. But it was just such a bold move, such a cool move.
Well, finally, as a proud mother and one who is very close to my mother and mother-in-law, I think it's beautiful that you conclude the book with your mother's story. Would you please share that?
Well, my mother is an immigrant from Colombia. And I was always, and I think it's one of the reasons, by the way, I'm fascinated with geography. As a kid, my grandmother would visit from Colombia, and I'd want to know what is Colombia like. It seemed almost fantastical. And my mother's from Bogota, which is very high up, so it's, she would say, always kind of cold and foggy. And in fact, what she did tell me about her childhood seemed sort of kind of misty, bathed in a kind of mist and fog. I knew a few things, but my mother was also very private and never really wanted to share much of her story. And I was surprised that in the writing of this, she came to me And she said, "Oh, are you going to write about me?" And at first I thought she was kidding, but then she asked again. And I realized my mother, I can't say how old she is. She would kill me, but I'll just say that she's 4 years shy of a really big birthday that has 3 digits. And I did that thing that people say you should do that I was oddly resistant to, which is I just started asking her questions and pushing and asking about her earlier life. And I knew the big data points, how she met my father. I knew things like that, but I didn't know, there was so much I didn't know about her upbringing. And like Frank McCourt, I think she was, let's just say, didn't want to talk about the scarcity of her upbringing. I think it was very painful. She's one of 7 kids, and her father, when she was a few months old, took the family to New York City from Columbia. His timing couldn't have been worse. It was the fall of 1928. A year later, the stock market crashed, and her father had to go back with the family, really kind of with his tail between his legs. At least that's how he felt. He was never the same. I think he was very humiliated. He was very glum, and it was very difficult, I think, for her to grow up like that. And so there was lots that she didn't want to talk about, but I think why I was so grateful that she asked me to write about her is it was not only an opportunity to learn more, because she opened up, but it also told me that she realized that her story is worth telling. And I think it's very sad, as I said, that people leave this world thinking sometimes that their story isn't worth telling. And I don't mean that not everyone can have a biopic. I mean, but I'm saying that it meant a lot to me that she asked me to write about her. Believe me, she had full approval over every word. Like any kind of journalistic sort of sorry, you know, it's out of your hands, no way. I mean, she liked every single word. I mean, like state media here. No, I'm kidding. But no, I wanted her to feel comfortable with what I wrote, certainly. But yeah, and it did make me think of Frank McCourt and Laura Ingalls Wilder a little bit, yeah.
Mo Rocca, this has been such a joy. I love your old soul.
Well, thank you, Lois, and I do have an old soul. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you.
And here's to a wonderfully successful book tour. Atlanta's the first stop.
That's right. It all starts with Atlanta. And thank you very much. Thank you, because I know what a figure, and justly so, you are here. So I'm very honored to start this tour with you.
That's right.